Let's talk about the moon in the sixth house. Here you can see what the sixth house is, literally speaking. It's the portion of the sky that's below the western horizon, and that is why it symbolizes everything that it symbolizes, which we could summarize on the phrase supporting the west. So what's the west all about? The west is where the sun sets. So it symbolizes disappearance, and it also symbolizes other people because the sun represents the self. If the sixth house supports that stuff, that means the sixth house is supportive of disappearance and supportive of other people. Being supportive of disappearance is why it's the house of uncertainty. Uncertainty is what allows you to lose things or not recognize things, not understand things, not be able to see things clearly. Now that's a kind of mental or intellectual sense of disappearance, but there's also a real physical sense of disappearance, like dying. And so the sixth house being supportive of dying is why it's the house of illness and has a lot to do with how well you digest. The sixth is also the house of enemies, because enemies are people that don't support you, they're supportive of other people. It's the house of duty, because duty is how we support other people. Finally, it's also the house of debt, because that's what we owe other people. And so it concerns matters of being indebted to and indentured to and in servitude to other people. Now let's discuss the moon. The moon is a bright planet that you see at night. And because of this dichotomy between being bright but night, it's a dichotomous or a dipolar planet. Because of that dipolarity that's inherent in the moon, it symbolizes fluctuation or change or cyclicity. Because of the brightness of the moon, it symbolizes beauty and attractiveness. Because of the nightness of the moon, it symbolizes what is unseen or private. Also, it symbolizes the unseen portion of the self, which is the internal self, so it signifies the mind. The mind is the thing that experiences emotions. Emotions are based on desires. Desires are based on opinion and subjectivity and bias. So the moon symbolizes all these things. And also, because it's internal, it symbolizes the internal gender, femininity. And finally, one more thing about it being bright, because it's bright, that symbolizes being powerful. But because it's internal, it symbolizes being feminine or internal power. So it symbolizes the feminine or maternal authority figure. Now, to understand the moon in the sixth house, all we have to do is think, what is it about the moon that really resonates with something about the sixth house? So, for example, the moon has to do with health, because beauty comes from health. So what does health resonate with? Well, health resonates with illness. The sixth house is about illness, but it resonates with it in a negative way, right? So that is something that is going to describe or allow us to intuit what the moon represents in the sixth house. Another thing is that the moon is a peace planet because it's shy. So it's tranquil and it's calm. But the sixth house is not peaceful, it's problematic, and it's about dealing with problems. So again, these things resonate with each other, but in a disharmonious way. And finally, the moon is a maternal planet, and the sixth house is a house of enemies. So in a sense, that's a clash, because the mother is supposed to be the friend, but the sixth house has to do with enemies. But in a sense, it's not entirely a clash, because the mother is authority and power. And putting power where the enemies are is pretty good. So these three resonances between the moon and the sixth house are the keys to intuiting what the moon symbolizes in the sixth house. I'll show you now how to unpack it a bit, how to expand it a bit and put it into words. Let's go up to the first one where the moon is health, but the sixth house is illness. This is why the moon in the sixth house signifies alpayus. Alpayu means disease or short-lived, short lifespan. And remember, disease means not easy. So the moon in the sixth house, besides this basic physical problem of illness or short life, it also signifies the sense of not being easy, not being an easy person, and not being at ease. Not really able to find comfort very easily. Now let me show you how you can unpack the second issue, the moon being peace, but the sixth house being problems. This one we would call amati. Amati means disagreeable. In conflict, not able to find peace, not very oriented towards conciliation. And now the third thing about the moon in the sixth house, which is really the main thing about the moon in the sixth house, is the issue of maternity and enmity. So again, amati is an important word here because we mentioned it's argumentative. But we're talking about being competent at fighting, competent at dealing with problems. So we could say that the moon in the sixth house signifies somebody who's argumentative in a brilliant way. Another word we can use to describe this particular resonance between the moon and the sixth house is paribhavi. Paribhavi means somebody who conquers others, someone who lays siege to others, someone who surrounds others, doesn't let others go, someone who belittles others, puts others down. So that also means someone who's very great, someone who's superior to others. So the moon in the sixth house, as a result of it being the maternal figure in the house of enemies, has the sense of just fighting others and defeating them and pushing the problems down, solving the problems, belittling others, and having kind of a superiority air to it. And finally, one interesting phrase describing this particular dynamic is udararogi. Now, in a sense, udararogi is just another way of saying alpayus, which means they get sick. But it also means they have something called the generosity disease. And this is a very interesting thing about the moon in the sixth house. Motherhood in the house of problems. Motherhood is generous, but now it's in a place where it has to deal with problems. So there's problems with generosity. The individual is either overly generous, giving way too much, or overly harsh, not being generous at all. Now that we're kind of clear, or hopefully getting clear about these three issues with the moon in the sixth house, we could look at some charts that have the moon in the sixth house and use those charts to clarify these ideas. So let's use Einstein, Vincent van Gogh, and Srila Prabhupada. Einstein is up first. Is Einstein a person who really illustrates the alpayus concept? Definitely. Half of his life was battling chronic diseases. Why does this aspect of the moon in the sixth house come through so vividly for Einstein? Well, what helps that a lot is the fact that it's his first lord in the sixth house. And not only does his first lord go to the sixth house, but his planet of disease, Saturn, is debilitated in a prominent place. Let's look at the next term, amati. The first aspect of it is to be very argumentative, successfully argumentative, brilliantly argumentative. He's very brilliant. Why does Einstein have such an intellectual twist on this argumentative nature of the moon in the sixth house? Well, that's really because his fifth lord is exalted in a very dominant position in the chart, where it's aspecting the ascendant very strongly and aspecting all the planets in its own 10th house very strongly, and where it's in Raja Yoga via house exchange. Second facet of amati is just plain disagreeable. And Einstein is an excellent example of a very disagreeable person. He's thought to have had autism, and autism is all about solitariness and disintegration with the conventional world and society. So he's very disagreeable. And why does his chart make that aspect of the moon come to such an extreme? Well, one of the things you should do, whatever house the moon is in, is you should also look at the fourth house, because the fourth house symbolizes many of the same things that the moon does. So in Einstein's case, his fourth lord is conjoined the debilitated Saturn. Now, another thing that we expect from the moon in the sixth is paribhavi. which means to belittle others and be much better than others. Einstein very, very much so. Very belittling towards others. Finally, did Einstein have Udara Rogi, the generosity disease? Super. And certainly in the sense of being very, very harsh and not gentle with family and wife and stuff like that. And the indicators of that, again, are the same as the indicators for disagreeableness. So it would be the fourth lord being in such conjunction with the debilitated Saturn. Now let's take a look at Vincent van Gogh's chart and see if that helps us crystallize these concepts about the moon in the sixth house. Alpayus, for Vincent van Gogh, extremely Alpayus. He only lived to be 37, and his cause of death is suicide. So was he not an easygoing person? Was he not at ease? Was he not comfortable? Extremely. So why so? Well, just like Einstein, his moon in the sixth house is also the first lord. But unlike Einstein, look at that combination that he has in the sixth house. His Ketu is right on top of that moon, and his sixth lord is right on top of that Ketu. So that's really a heavy duty moon in the sixth house. How about the quality of Amati being disagreeable? Very disagreeable, very difficult for him to deal with people. Not very well integrated into society, not very well integrated into relationships. What really helps this come out, besides that tremendous combination that he has in the sixth house? Saturn being in his 11th house, which is the house of being at ease and sociable and so forth, which gives a very strong aspect to his ascendant, which is also an indication of not liking himself. Paribhavi, meaning that he should be better than other people and belittling of other people. Super, he's extremely renowned. Why so? Look at his 10th house. It has the exalted sun in it. So you see, the real point is, when you have something like moon in the sixth house, then you have a palette, to use Van Gogh analogies, you have a palette of colors that you could paint with, but not every moon in the sixth house will choose to use the same colors in the painting of that individual, depending on what the rest of the chart is like. And Udara Rogi, the generosity disease for Van Gogh, very much. He's a really good illustration of the generosity disease, especially in how he took in the prostitute and the pregnant prostitute with her daughter and took care of her, and then she just went on to not love him at all, and then he just moved out. So his life is full of this too much generosity to the wrong people, giving love and never getting it back, and then being very grumpy about that and very disturbed about that. Again, you don't really need too much else in a chart to explain how difficult this particular moon in the sixth house is, because it's right next to Ketu and right next to the sixth lord. But just bear in mind that he also has the 9th lord in the sixth house with Ketu. So the 9th house is kind of like how well your generosity will pay off, how much result you will get from good deeds. And if it's in the 6th house, then you don't really get fair reciprocation for your efforts. Now, of course, Van Gogh is the great painter, and we didn't really see anything about him being a great painter in any of these issues. It's because there's a lot of things about him besides him being a great painter. But since we have his chart up here on the screen, let's just mention some of the things. The classic thing to look for artistic skill is combination of 3rd, 5th, and 11th house. And look at Vincent van Gogh's 9th house, where he has Mars and Venus together. That's the 5th lord conjoining the 11th lord, while both of them perfectly aspect the 3rd house. On top of that, the combination of this 5th and 11th lord aspecting the 3rd house is a Raj Yoga, because they're also the 4th and the 5th lords. And on top of that, he has another Raj Yoga to his 1st lord by virtue of it joining his 9th. Finally, let's look at Prabhupada. Is Prabhupada a good example of Alpayus? No, not really. He lived to 81 and he was fairly healthy. So why? Well, look at his first house. Unlike Einstein and Van Gogh, where their first lord goes to the 6th house, instead his first lord goes to the 11th, where it aspects the first. So his first house is strong. So you can't really expect his health to be difficult or his life to be short. How about Amati? Amati, Prabhupada is a great example of Amati. Very argumentative and very convincing. So that's partly just because he has Capricorn rising and therefore his 6th house is Gemini, and therefore a moon in the 6th house is also a moon in Gemini, and Gemini is an intelligent sign and a sign that knows how to communicate. So moon in Gemini in the 6th really knows how to debate or present an argument or convince you of something. And disagreeable, very disagreeable. And again, look to the 4th house for that, because 4th house is about the house of agreement and harmony. And here comes his 4th lord into the 6th house. So both his moon and his 4th lord are in the 6th house. Paribhavi, he's extremely renowned and also very belittling. Very kind of condescending or belittling of things which are inferior or subordinate or not worthwhile. And so why is he so superior? Well, look at his 9th and his 10th house. This is really where his power lies, is in the mutual exchange between his 9th lord and his 10th lord, creating a Raj Yoga. And did Prabhupada have Udara Rogi, the generosity disease? He's a good example of it, because on one hand, he gave so much of himself. He sacrificed everything for this cause. And there's no way that you can get back the reciprocation of that amount of sacrifice. So in one sense, he's very, very overly generous. But in the other sense, he's extremely strict and very unforgiving and very unyielding. And so he has both aspects of the generosity disease. And to look at for a reason why this is so well illustrated in Prabhupada, it's first of all just simple that his 4th lord is in the 6th house with the moon. So both the moon and the 4th lord being in the 6th house. But also take a look at Jupiter, which is kind of the opposite of this. By nature, Jupiter is generous and positive. His Jupiter is in the 8th house with Ketu, exactly with Ketu. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much.